This is Isaiah 66, the last chapter of the book, verse 1. Yahweh says, "Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build to me? Where will I rest? For my hand has made all these things, and so all these things came to be, says Yahweh. But I'll look to this man, even to he who is poor and of a contrite spirit, and who trembles at my word." Comment in verses 1 and 2, Yahweh asks, "Since heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool, will I be satisfied to dwell in a temple? No, the dwelling I choose is with the man who's poor and contrite of spirit, who trembles at my word." 1 Corinthians 3:16, quote, "Don't you know that you are a temple of God and that God's Spirit lives in you?" End quote. Coming up, Yahweh burns with anger against men who worship Him outwardly but live to themselves. The more religious service they perform, the more they sacrifice, the angrier God gets. God counts them as an abomination. This is in contrast to the man who trembles at His word, with whom God dwells. Verse 3. "He who kills an ox is as he who kills a man. He who sacrifices a lamb as he who breaks a dog's neck. He who offers an offering as he who offers pig's blood. He who burns frankincense as he who blesses an idol. Yes, they've chosen their own ways, and their soul delights in their abominations. I also will choose their delusions and will bring their fears on them, because when I called, no one answered. When I spoke, they didn't listen, but they did that which was evil in my eyes, and chose that in which I didn't delight." Comment in verse 3, "If a man chooses to live as he pleases, it galls God to see him bring a sacrifice. Don't even come near me with your sacrifices," He says. It doesn't matter what the man offers. He's as despicable to God as a murderer or someone who breaks a dog's neck, offers pig's blood, or blesses an idol. To obey is better than sacrifice, 1 Samuel 15:22. In verse 4, if they choose their own ways, God says He'll choose their delusions. The meaning of the Hebrew word here translated delusions is uncertain. It's also translated that God will choose their harsh treatment, punishment, and vexation. Whatever He chooses for them, it won't be good. When He called, they didn't answer. When He spoke, they didn't listen, but did evil. Now back to the man who trembles at His word, verse 5. "Hear Yahweh's word, you who tremble at His word. Your brothers who hate you, who cast you out for my name's sake, have said, 'Let Yahweh be glorified that we may see your joy.' But it's those who shall be disappointed." Comment in verse 5, the hypocrites have everything exactly backward. They're deluded, as in verse 4. They think they're godly, and they think the humble man is evil. They figure when Yahweh is glorified, that is, when the will of God is done, there will be no joy for the humble man, who they think is wicked. The man they think is wicked is actually a humble host of God's presence, and when that man suffers, the hypocrite figures it's justice that the humble man had it coming. The crucifixion would be an example. Deluded religious hypocrites thought they were doing God a service, sending Jesus to the cross, that it was only justice that Jesus should suffer, all of it being a delusion. In verse 5, it's the many deluded religious people who will be disappointed, not the few humble men they think are the problem. They'll be disappointed when there's, verse 6, a voice of tumult from the city, a voice from the temple, a voice of Yahweh that repays His enemies what they deserve. Comment in verse 6, God will send a disaster on Jerusalem to repay His enemies. There will be tumult in Jerusalem on the day it falls and on the day the temple is destroyed. This has happened twice in the course of history since Isaiah prophesied it. But coming up, the nation will be reborn, verse 7. "Before she travailed, she gave birth. Before her pain came, she delivered a son. Who has heard of such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall a land be born in one day? Shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion travailed, she gave birth to her children. Shall I bring to the birth and not cause to be delivered, says Yahweh? Shall I who caused to give birth shut the womb, says your God? Rejoice with Jerusalem and be glad for her, all you who love her. Rejoice for joy with her, all you who mourn over her, that you may nurse and be satisfied at the comforting breasts, that you may drink deeply and be delighted with the abundance of her glory. For Yahweh says, Behold, I'll extend peace to her like a river, and the glory of the nations like an overflowing stream, and you will nurse. You'll be carried on her side and will be dandled on her knees. As one whom his mother comforts, so I'll comfort you. You'll be comforted in Jerusalem. You'll see it, and your heart shall rejoice, and your bones will flourish like the tender grass. Yahweh's hand will be known among his servants, and he'll have indignation against his enemies. Comment in verses 7 to 14, the nation will be reborn. Miraculously, it'll happen in one day. In verse 7, Zion will give birth to children before she even goes into labor, which means the rebirth will be painless and quick. The land will be repopulated. In verses 11 and 12, Zion's children will nurse at her breasts. She'll bounce them on her knee and delight in them, which means that in that reborn nation there will be security, love, and joy. God will give the land peace like a river, comfort, abundance, and glory. In verse 13, God will comfort the land as a mother comforts her nursing child. It all sounds like the establishment of the Zion of the millennium, which will occur suddenly on the day of the Lord's return. Some have interpreted this passage as the sudden reestablishment of Israel on May 14, 1948, and that interpretation may be completely valid. But if that's a correct interpretation, the day of Israel's founding was only a starting point. That did occur suddenly, as the passage describes. There's a long way to go before peace, love, and a knowledge of the Lord abound in the land, but that doesn't invalidate the interpretation because the passage doesn't exactly say that the land would enjoy all her benefits on day one. Whether or not the passage applies to May 14, 1948, it certainly applies to the day of the Lord's return. Coming up, that day will come. It's Jesus' second coming when he returns in power and glory. He comes to gather his own, destroy his enemies, and as verses 7 to 14 just said, to establish Zion. Verse 15, for behold, Yahweh will come with fire, and his chariots will be like the whirlwind, to render his anger with fierceness and his rebuke with flames of fire. For Yahweh will execute judgment by fire and by his sword on all flesh, and those slain by Yahweh will be many. Comment speaking of those who worship other gods, verse 17. Those who sanctify themselves and purify themselves to go to the gardens behind one in the middle, eating pig's meat, abominable things, and the mouse, they shall come to an end together, says Yahweh, for I know their works and their thoughts. Comment in verse 17, there must have been a religion involving a foreign god, and as part of their practice they walked behind their cult leader into gardens to worship, and other wayward Israelites did abominable things such as eating mice and pig's meat, which are a violation of the law of Moses. These would just be a couple of examples of how Israel went off the rails. Speaking of future ages in which God will remedy all that, still in verse 18, the time comes that I'll gather all nations and languages, and they'll come and will see my glory. I'll set a sign among them, and I'll send those who escape of them to the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, who draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, to faraway islands, who've not heard my fame, nor have seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the nations. They shall bring all your brothers out of all the nations for an offering to Yahweh, on horses, in chariots, in litters, on mules, and on camels, to my holy mountain Jerusalem, says Yahweh, as the children of Israel bring their offering in a clean vessel into Yahweh's house. Of them I'll also select priests and Levites, says Yahweh. For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, says Yahweh, so your offspring and your name shall remain. It shall happen that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh will come to worship before me, says Yahweh. They'll go out and look at the dead bodies of the men who've transgressed against me, for their worm will not die, nor will their fire be quenched, and they'll be loathsome to all mankind. Comment in verses 18 to 24, Yahweh won't settle for a world where Israel spends all day profaning his name and the Gentiles are ignorant of him. In verse 18, he'll gather all nations and languages to come see his glory. He'll reveal himself to the world. In verse 19, some will escape from the Gentile nations. In other words, some of them will be saved. Those escapees will travel to the farthest peoples on earth and evangelize them. Tarshish, Pul, Lud, Tubal, and Javan are some of the farthest locations in the Hebrew vocabulary. In other words, Gentile missionaries will travel the world and deliver the Word of God. In verse 20, speaking of the Gentile nations, they'll bring all their gifts to God to His holy mountain, Jerusalem. They'll visit the Lord Jesus Christ at His temple, which is Yahweh's house, in verse 20. Speaking of those Gentiles, Yahweh says, quote, "Of them I'll select priests and Levites," end quote. To be a priest or Levite at that time will be a dream job, and there'll be Gentiles in those positions of all things. It's the millennium. Then in verse 22, Yahweh moves on to another age, which will be even better. There'll be a new heavens and earth, which He shall make, and they'll remain, which means the new heavens and earth will be forever. And in verse 22, so your offspring shall remain, meaning the offspring of the righteous will remain forever. They're the offspring of the righteous in the spiritual sense. They're the future generations of believers. They'll remain forever. In verse 23, all flesh will worship Yahweh in that day. And in verse 24, the last verse of the book, quote, "They'll go out and look at the dead bodies of the men who have transgressed against me, for their worm will not die, nor will their fire be quenched." The worm not dying and the fire not being quenched indicates the punishment is eternal, Mark 9:43-48. But why should the righteous of that age go out and see the dead bodies of those who transgressed? It's because the dead bodies are evidence that justice has been done, and justice will be a beautiful thing to men who are perfected in glory. That's the end of the book. Thanks for joining us. Find our other material 3 ways. Search for the Land of Havilah channel on YouTube. Our website is landofhavilah.net. Then on most podcast apps, search for the Land of Havilah channel.